point I said, I'm curious, what do you make of this? Does it matter? Well,
Hi,
Jeff, you're making it.
how are you?
Is that candy under there?
It's a great story.
I made it.
And I said,
I'm here. I'm good. The parking lot was better
It's
than last
the
week.
launch pad.
Hi.
A discussion that I think is well
No,
worth having
agreed.
in the morning.
Yeah, I'm pretty layered out here.
But I may have not done a very good job.
Only this week we can take our
To
pants
her,
off.
Her.
you know, I think I did see you on mine.
You did, and I
I know
She
there were
wrote
very
back
many
and
cards in
said,
the
did
law.
she?
yeah, she wrote back and said,
Huh?
great. Guys,
I
are
saw
doing
you
what
there,
you're
but
doing.
That's a lot. I didn't want to park
But then
it.
it occurred to me on my way in that
They put
her
lots of salt down.
boys, but we should have a bit of a hearing. And I wrote to her and asked her, do we have permission
I know.
to
I
quote
found
what
it's
she
not
wrote?
very impressive.
And she wrote back
It
and
was
said,
not, it was,
so I thought in the assessment part,
I decided
maybe I or
the
either
upper
of
lot
you
No, we better.
was better
to
than.
quote what she said. I mean, it's a fine point. We're going about it in a slightly totally
Yeah, I
different way. We are celebrating music, we are
Absolutely.
listening to it. But I think that it gives a
I don't know, it's just
balance
discussing that with
in a
Barbara.
way.
We're
Is that
gonna
okay
get
with you if I do
It's
that?
absolutely okay. I mean, what I said to her was, you get to make your case on the podium.
Yeah, so you have to decide, I'm gonna go to Cheesecake Factory and pick something
And
else.
everybody, she said, they all get it, and the audience gets it, they love it. And I won't speak for you, but I know you agree. I want the audience to think about some other aspects. We're all going to
Hi, how are you? I'm good.
We're all going to
Easier to get here today than it was
Well,
last week.
appreciate the brilliance of the composition.
TV dinner.
But it's a fair question to ask.
And these crazy people.
Was there an intent?
I'm sorry, yeah.
I mean, you said last night, yeah, oh, work of art as it is. But I asked her, well, what is it? You know, when he said no, like she used the example of Four Seasons. It's a story. I said, yes, there's a text. He said, Exodus. It's such a specific text. I think it's fair to ask. Just on one page, compositional abilities. Maybe, you said the other night, maybe it's an entertainment, and it's a really good one. So perfect. I just find it more interesting
I do too.
to get right.
And also, you know, she makes the point, which I think is a fair one. To handle any politics or theology on pride. Once you give birth to your baby, it's in the world. And you have to, you know, intention is one thing.
I know, it's so wonderful. This is so It's great.
Okay.
We talk a lot about affect, moving, and so on. He must have had in mind what he wanted to contain. Was it simply not for me supposed to pay me money?
I knew this was going to be here, so it really.
But it's actually for me an argument.
Help me get here, yeah, earlier, I
It
didn't
wasn't
stop
honor,
at
just
home.
paid by the king. I think it is an argument. Call it political, that may be bad.
No, I don't think it is.
Patriotic.
This is so wonderful.
Patriotic text at the time. I'm not convinced he was a
How are you? I don't recognize
They'll
people.
say that I'm Messiah.
That's fine, thank you. And you?
I think.
He couldn't have been
Good morning.
the political.
Just got here. Yeah, I'm glad. It's awful out there.
What is wrong with you?
We have forgot this is
Not
Oh, I loved it.
good.
the deliverance of enslavement.
You're good. I knew that once
He
you,
wasn't the student.
once you got into it, that you would.
Well, it's a fascinating conversation.
But I, a model that was his name.
No, I wonder.
I learned them all
Would it make sense
for the exhibit that came.
quote that?
You can see.
Well, it's possible. The only thing
But I
is,
remember,
it's a compelling statement about the work itself.
yeah,
And it might overshadow, or at least shadow what we're doing. I think at the end when we're assessing,
Okay.
does it make sense to you?
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
are you coming,
It's clear.
Rabbi Klein at 7? Yes.
My seven people came.
Good morning.
Said, boy, it was interesting.
I'm not a big person.
This is the last name of, that's the family name.
Now you're pulling me up or what?
Oh, is he cute?
That's adorable. Debbie created it.
It's a cute shirt too.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm sure the kids like wearing it.
Oh, very lovely, I'll tell you.
Oh, cool.
So,
And the rest, maybe you'll just put at the end of that. Sure.
oh, this is for,
Lily, I didn't know I had my red pen on. I started writing red.
oh, that's good.
Thank you. What?
Oh, yes, it's chilly. Have we?
Well, good morning, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. We are officially open, and Mother Nature has conspired against us a bit, but we're going to plow on. So glad that those of you who are here, and welcome to those of you who are live streaming. It's blustery outside, and by the way, the sidewalks are slippery. So please do be careful on your way out. You know, Doris slipped last week and had to have surgery. She's on the mend. She's doing fine. Yeah, she fractured a bone in her upper leg. And I saw her not go down, but to try to get up. So do be careful out there. And it's a little beguiling, actually, because the snow is covering it. So we need to be a little bit careful. Bagels are there, prepackaged, and coffee and tea, and this is what we're going to be doing from now on. So I'm hoping and believe that our numbers will increase as the weather is a bit more conducive. But in any event, we have this alternative mode, live streaming, which is very, very good. I have brought my phone for live streamers to send me a message about what we're talking about. I have forgotten to pick up those messages for the last 6 Torah Study sessions. So I wouldn't be critical if you didn't believe I was going to do it, but I'm gonna try to think about it. Okay, so you know what? I think the rabbis will confirm what I'm about to say, that there's no such thing as too many shehechianus. Is there a limit?
No.
So we are officially opened. We have bagels again. Doesn't this call for a little bit of a celebration?
Yes.
And then as our numbers continue to grow, we'll say shechli maybe every week. It's been just about 2 years since we closed down. Who would have thought 2 years ago that we really would still be doing this 2 years later, but we've managed to survive it. So let's say a shechianu. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who has kept us alive, sustained us, and enabled us to arrive at this special moment. Amen. Okay. let's continue with the blessing for the study of Torah. Before we do that, though, and lest I forget, the custom here has been, I think it's important to kind of reiterate our customs along the way since it's been a little bit of time, that anytime you want another bagel or another cup of coffee, just get up and do it. I'm not bothered, and I sense that nobody else is. If you need at any point to come in a little bit late in the morning or leave early, again, do not feel the least bit self-conscious about it. It's just wonderful to have you for the time that you can be here. And if you've got something to do at 10:30 or 11 o'clock, but can be here from 9:15 to 10, all the better. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through his commandments, enjoining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. Okay, so we are in the second issue opened up by Immanuel Kant at the end of the Critique of Pure Reason, the four basic questions. In the critique itself, there are only three questions mentioned, and his logic, the fourth one is, which we treated first. And those questions are, what can I know? What ought I to do? For what can I hope? And what does it mean to be human? And in the early months of our study, we looked at what does it mean to be human. Now we're in the middle of talking about ethics. I've confessed to you that this philosophical head likes order and structure, and I'm not sure I see any of it in the Torah's view of ethics. It's not that there are not a lot of profundities, but it's hard to see clearly exactly what the Torah is up to. There are certainly divine commands. We have noticed that there are elements of natural law and natural understanding. After all, Abraham could not have known what God meant when he said to him, I have called Abraham to teach his children righteousness and justice. He could not have understood that unless he had some sense, without being taught, what righteousness and justice are. So I think the Torah presupposes a kind of natural wisdom, that it's not all positivistic in the sense of having been promulgated, but some of it is what we can discern ourselves by using our heads and observing the world. We also notice that stories convey ethical maxims, ethical ideas, some of which cannot be commanded. Honor the relationships that others have with one another, as David does not with Uriah and Bathsheba. He's willing to run ragged over that relationship. And it seems to me one of the things we can learn from Nathan's chastisement is that we ought to care about not only ourselves, not only about our relationships, but the relationships of others, so that stories are another vehicle. I'm also interested in the question, I think, which we'll try to look at a little bit later this morning, on the issue of character. Does the Bible concern itself with the development of character? I make a distinction between character and personality. Personality is what we project outwardly to others. Character is what we more deeply are, in the sense of some continuity. Character, I think, better than personality, can resist temptation. If personality is our relationship with others, we often think about how others are perceiving us when we present ourselves to them. Character, I think, is to some degree maybe not totally impervious to those temptations. Character is about the virtues, doing what we are meant to do, or developing the potential with which we are born as fully as possible. And is the Torah interested, aside from particular acts and particular ways of understanding our relationship to others, is it also concerned about the development of character? Certainly that's a big concern of Aristotle and Aristotelians. Maimonides found it not difficult to bring Aristotle into the world of Torah, and maybe it's fair for us to do the same sort of thing, not that we're going to look very deeply at Aristotle. So you have these sheets, which is a way of dealing with a central chapter in the Bible and very concerned with ethics and activities, and that is Leviticus 19. Let's first take a look at a couple of sections of Leviticus 19, and then we'll go to these sheets, which draw out more implications. I'm just going to quote what it is we're going to be exploring. But before that, let's look at the first couple of verses. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the whole Israelite community." Okay? So ethics, behavior, these admonitions are not for the elite, and they're not just for men, even though it's clear that biblical society is patriarchal. Though, as I've tried to argue over the years, there is a counter-narrative which challenges the adequacy of patriarchy and shows us the power and importance of a woman's role in society and in cultivating the kind of values that the Torah is about. So this notion of et kol adat b'nei Yisrael, the entirety of the Israelite community. There's a kind of democratic impulse in this. I think it's wrong to be anachronistic and try to find democracy back in the Bible. But I think there are some democratic impulses, the entirety of the people. And say to them, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." This is a crucial statement. How would Aristotle write it? Be moderate, because moderation, the golden mean, is the way to live a good life. Or try to emulate large-souled individuals. No. What Aristotle is pointing to is the golden mean, a balance. What the Bible is after is infinity. Be holy, on what grounds? For I, the Lord your God, am holy. God is the model here, or I might put it, the top of the ladder that we are called to climb. And what is the top of the ladder? To be as holy as God is, which we will not be able to accomplish. So whereas Aristotle, if you think of a kind of a spectrum between the two ends, Aristotle is driving for kind of a middle ground. Whereas the Bible is dealing with a spectrum that starts at 0 and ends in infinity. And that we should strive to be as close to that as we possibly can, knowing that there's always more to accomplish, but that we can never accomplish all of it. I once read a comment that the monks in early Christianity stamped infinity on the mind of the West. It's an interesting comment. The ascetics, those who eschew normal life and go and live a life of pure devotion to a set of, I might call it narrow, that's not evaluative, it's just descriptive, they're up to something more narrow. reading Psalms over and over and over and over again. And here, one could say that monkish ascetic life is an attempt to climb this kind of ladder, to get as close to holiness as they possibly can, as close to God as they possibly can. And when will they succeed? Never. They stamped infinity on the mind of the West. I love that idea. I think that Leviticus verse 2 is doing the same thing. So this notion, and we've looked at this before, emulating God. You remember, as God clothed the naked, so should you clothe the naked. As God buried the dead, you should bury the dead. Imitatio Dei, the imitation of God, is one of the models of biblical ethics. And yet what's pointed out here is, yes, that's valid and worthwhile, but you'll never fully accomplish it. If someone tried to emulate me, they probably could do it reasonably quickly, if not to exceed, because we're limited, and God is not. Okay, so verse 3, you shall each revere his mother and his father and keep my Sabbaths. I, the Lord, am your God. And we've looked at that already. It's on your sheets on page 3 at the top, and we're not going to go over it again, but it's worth rereading. Rashi reads it as a mini narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end in a brilliant interpretation. Let's look at verse 9, which we are going to look at. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap all the way to the edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Notice there are two actions here. The action in the middle of the act and the action after you've completed the act. While you're reaping your fields, don't go to the utter corner of the field, getting it all, but round it off so that you are, while you're doing this, leaving something left over. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap all the way to the edges or gather the gleanings. The gleanings are what is being dropped as you are harvesting. Don't go back and pick them up. Don't do something while you're harvesting, and don't do something when you've finished harvesting. Two actions. Verse 10, you shall not pick your vineyard bare. That's analogous to rounding off the corners. Leave something while you're picking the grapes. Or gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard after the fact. So there are four actions here divided into two sets, each set indicating kind of a beginning act and a concluding act. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I, the Lord, am your God. And we have to deal with that last phrase too. What is being intimated with, what is being added here by saying, I, the Lord, am your God? I don't think it's crystal clear what it means, but I think we want to talk about it. Then if we move to verse 17, we have again, I think, a mini narrative here in verses 17 and 18. We have 5 commandments here. You shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Let's leave that alone for a minute and go to the end of 18. Love your fellow as yourself. So the movement of this mini narrative is from hate to love. Or to put it in terms of process, assuming that we have a predilection to dislike, to suspect, even to dislike intensely other people, that hatred in the heart is a human propensity. And I think I'll speak for myself. I've engaged in that myself. I hope not in a ruthless, self-destructive way, but we do have negative feelings about others. And what the Torah here is interested in is purging ourselves of these negative feelings. And we'll want to ask the question, why? It has something to do with the well-being of the individual and the well-being of society in which we individuals play a role. So this mini narrative is an attempt through three intermediate commandments as the process by which to move from hate to love. Let's just see it, and then we're going to go to our text. You shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Reprove, chastise, criticize your kinsman, but incur no guilt because of him. That's ambiguous, which our text will draw out. You shall, so, commandment 1, don't hate. Commandment 5, love. 2, 3, and 4 are the process. 2 is reprove your kinsman. 3, don't take vengeance. And 4, or bear a grudge. If we can find a way properly, effectively, to criticize those who hurt us, do us wrong, or who are doing wrong, whether we are the object of it, if we find a way to criticize, and there's a hornet's nest of dangers here, which we have to sort out, what is the right way to criticize and what is the wrong way? In other words, this commandment does not tell us much as it sits here in the Torah. It requires interpretation. Unless I'm just interested abstractly what I ought to do. Oh, I see, I should criticize, I should reprove my neighbor. Yeah, no, I understand that. And then let me go on about my business. But if I'm really interested in the how and not in the what, I have to have somebody unpack this very loaded idea of criticizing. Don't take vengeance. Don't bear a grudge. What is each of those things? What's the difference between the two? Are they complementary to one another? Is it a pair? Because the Torah is suggesting here, if you look at this narratively, we don't have to look at it narratively, that there's a flow between verse 17 and 18. If you look at it narratively, what the Torah is suggesting here is this is the way to get to the conclusion. You don't have to look at it that way. We can see this is just 5 different admonitions. Don't hate, reprove, and so on. Love your neighbor as yourself. Standalone. But it's not a standalone if you look at this together, which we're going to do. And then I want to look finally at verse 32. You shall rise before the aged and show deference to the old. What is that? How do you do that? And by the way, by the old as a category, what does it include? Does it include everybody who's old? Or does it include a subset of everyone who is old, depending upon a norm? And the tradition has both, which we're going to look at. And then again, you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. What's the meaning of that in the context of this commandment? You shall fear your God, and so on. So those are the elements that I want to take a look at. Was there something else I wanted to look at too? I guess not. So let's look on our sheets first at page 3. And this is a comment by Rashi on verse 9. Let me read verse 9 again. When you reap the harvest of your land, don't reap all the way to the edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. And the gleanings are known in Hebrew as leket, that which is to be gathered. So, and that's what Rashi is commenting on. Neither shall thou collect the gleanings of your harvest. So of the four actions, the before and the after in terms of harvest, the before and after in terms of pruning your vines, Rashi is now concerned with action number 2. Don't go back and pick stuff up. Okay? And here's Rashi's comment, which I think is cryptic, and we want to think about it. Gleanings are the ears that drop from the hand of the harvester during the reaping. Okay? This is not about the corners. This is about the stuff that's being dropped. 1 or 2 at a time. See, this is Rashi. 1 or 2 at a time, but 3 do not come under the category of leket. The category of leket is don't go back and pick stuff up. 1 or 2 that you've dropped, fine. But 3, and I take it what it means is 3 on, don't come under the category of leket. The don't go back and pick them up category. Okay? So what do you think Rashi is up to here? What are the implications of this? Bennett?
You still have to provide for your own family.
Very good, very good. The first thing to say about it is that there's a limit. The Torah doesn't suggest limit, but Rashi is saying there is. So notice that Rashi is adding something. What is Rashi doing here? So the text, let's call the text X. Let's call Rashi's addition Y. XY. What's the status of Y? The letter Y. How would one evaluate what Y is? In any interpretation, you've got an X and a Y unit. You've got the text, and then you have somebody's understanding of that text. What could we say about Y? Bill?
It's sort of the manual for personal action as opposed to the pronouncement. And what strikes me about the whole laying down of laws is that it does not take a utopian approach to society. It takes society as it was then and tries to refine man's, shall we say, making man more social or civil.
That's an excellent comment.
Rather rather than acquisitive. And,
the very notion of limit is, I might say, perhaps this is an exaggeration, a qualification on a utopian impulse. Utopian impulses, I take it, have no use for inherent limits. We're going to do the best we can without putting any limits on it until we reach the final goal. And the word utopia, as we've said on many occasions, comes from the Greek that means no place, nowhere. Utopia is a concept, an idea. I might say an asymptote. The limit of what can happen. You know, with a certain formula, the line in the graph approaches infinity, though it never gets there. If one were to have the formula x times y equals 1, as the x term gets larger, the y term gets smaller, right? X times y, 2 over 1, 2 over 1/2, 3 over 1/3. If x is 3, y is 1/3, you still have 1, 10 1/10. Take this to its limit, 1,000,000 1,000,000th. As soon as the y term reaches 0, you have infinity, because if y is 0, x has to be infinity. Of course, it never reaches it, but it's approaching it. Utopia is the idea of approaching infinity. And the very notion of limit, which Bennett suggests here, there must be a limit to how much I leave, because there's another consideration, namely our and our family's well-being. And Bill makes a very, very nice point here. Not only is it anti-utopian, but it is a manual in the sense of how to go about doing it. It's not just we leave you on your own. We're going to tell you how to do it and what the limits are of what to do. Bennett?
I don't think that this means that 2 is the limit. It's saying that depending on your ability, if you're very wealthy, you may leave 3 or 4. Or the gleaner may pick up 3 or 4. If the owner, if you go back to the story of Ruth, I think Boaz told his men, leave a lot of gleanings for Ruth.
Right, and Bennett is adding another interesting point. The text can be taken as a kind of distillate of a larger understanding. Don't put a stumbling block before the blind. Does this mean that if I see a blind person coming down the road, I shouldn't look for a log to put in front of the blind? Don't do that. Or is it a general statement about don't take advantage of those who may not understand all the components of a situation? And Bennett is expanding that idea even to Rashi, that Rashi shouldn't be taken literally as only to, but it's a concept, depending on a variety of circumstances, your well-being, the neediness of the people who don't have enough, that will present the limit. So both the text need interpretation, and the interpretation of the text needs interpretation, right? And this is why we might have what we call super commentaries. A commentary on a commentary. Not only does Rashi comment on the text, there are texts that are comments on Rashi. Bennett has now proposed comment 1. Rashi doesn't mean, how do I know this? Because it stands to reason that Rashi can't be just applying a mechanical idea here. He's promoting a concept that there ought to be a limit if you take the text as meaning as the more I leave, the better a person I am. Rashi's here to tell you that's not proper thinking, because you might be hurting yourself. There's a kind of maximum minimum problem here. The more, the less, the less. And I don't have an obligation to impoverish myself or to imperil my family. So there's the idea here, which should not be taken literally. When I ask what's the status of this interpretation, I'm asking a question for which there's no answer, but I love the question and I think about it a lot. It just so happens that I have participated in a series on canonization, when Scripture comes to be fixed, both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Forest Hills Church is now engaged in a 10-12 session series of lectures, of discussions on that question. I gave lecture number 1, and I'm going to give lecture number 10 in a couple of weeks. And the question, what I dealt with first, was how the Bible came to be as an authoritative text and then as a canonical text. It's a fascinating question. What I'm going to deal with the next time is the idea of an open canon. We think of canon as a group of entities that have fixed boundaries. Here's the Bible. Here's the canonical biblical text. Canon comes from the Greek that means a standard or a rule. This is the standard for judging all other things. It has impermeable boundaries. By that I mean, once these books in here are canonized, they're within the boundaries, within the covers for good. They can never be taken out. And nothing outside can ever come in. So that in the history of the Christian church, the Council of Trent, which was a counter-Reformation council, included books in its canon that had not been included before. I'm not sure I'm saying this right. Because Luther returned to the biblical books of the Old Testament. The Catholic Church had added others from the Apocrypha, and Luther took them out. Luther, in other words, didn't think these boundaries were impermeable, certainly not the Christian Bible. He returned to this. But Trent added books back in. That suggests an open canon, open to inclusion and exclusion. Certainly, the canon of Western literature is an open canon, isn't it? 100 years ago, was Toni Morrison in the canon? No. Now, it depends. Whether you think that her work belongs in the canon. What about African literature? If we come to read it and read it sympathetically, should we include it in the canon of literature courses in the university? Columbia famously has a core curriculum, 2 years of the study of the classics of Western literature. Should Columbia begin to consider including the great texts from Africa or from Asia? Saul Bellow famously said, "Show me an African Homer and I'll consider including it in the literature." That was a little bit derisive, wasn't it? Well, look, Columbia thinks about this question every single year. What are we going to do this year? On the assumption that the canon is open. It's subject to inclusion and exclusion, right? Spinoza's ethics. Some years it's in, some years it's not in. This canon is closed. Nobody would ever think of asking that question about this. Should we take a book out of this? Should we take Ecclesiastes out? Should we add Ben Sira? Ben Sira was highly regarded by the rabbis, and they quote it as scripture. But it was written too late to be included in the canon. Should we think about including Ben Sira now? That's a question that our tradition doesn't ask. But it does seem to me, this is a roundabout way to getting to this point, that the question of interpretation raises the issue, this is what I'm going to do at the church, of the open canon for Jews. And here's where I might be right or wrong. If you think of interpretation as always extrinsic to the text, somebody taking his or her hand at interpretation, and that interpretation stands next to the text. I'm going to make a distinction between a horizontal and a vertical understanding. Text, interpretation. But there's another way of looking at it, And that is this way. The interpretation draws out what is already inherent in the text. And in this sense, the text is open because we're constantly drawing more meaning from the text itself, and therefore adding to the corpus of the whole. And that's one of the, why I raised this question, what is the status of Rashi's interpretation? Is it merely outside the text, and we like it, we don't, it's profound, it's not profound, or is it already inherent in the text itself? An analogy from left field. When my son was like 1.5, he came to my bedside one morning with a baseball in his hand, and he said, and here's how he said it, "Pay ball." And I thought to myself, this is inside this kid. This kid was born with this predilection. I might have taught him, and that would have been this. But pay ball at 1.5 is kind of this, that this new expression of his was already there, and it's just being drawn out. It's new, but it's old. It's new, but it's canonical. It's inside. What do you think? Let's take a little vote here. On Rashi. So, is Rashi's interpretation extrinsic or intrinsic to the text itself? Let me give you a chance to come up with an answer. I'm not writing down what you're voting on. Gary, you have...
It's extrinsic.
Oh, I wasn't yet asking that. You're saying extrinsic. How many think extrinsic? Equivocating.
Yeah. Not sure.
How many aren't sure? No. You don't get a not, you're not sure is too easy. One of the nice things about voting, by the way, is it forces us, even if only inside our own heads, to take a stand and then to be able to think about it. If I don't take a stand, I have nothing to think about. You know, I said intrinsic. At 2 o'clock this afternoon, why did I say intrinsic? Why did I say it? See, that's the virtue of taking a stand, seeing what we think. How many think it's intrinsic? Okay, very good. How many think it's extrinsic? Okay, I think the extrinsics have it. And let me just say that I think you're really off base. I'm kidding about that, of course. I'm kidding about that. It's an interesting question, though, isn't it? What's inherent and what's added on? And I don't think we can finally get to the bottom of it. No, it's a matter of feel of it. Lynn, did you have a comment?
I was just going to say, I remember your teachings where you said the Bible says what it says because it's in context of when it was.
Yeah.
So I know that rabbis have readjusted some of the parts of the Bible, but it's intrinsic to the time it came about and its interpretation.
Yeah. Now, Lynn is raising another really interesting point. How do we best understand, let's say, the biblical text? What we've been doing so far is a kind of new criticism. The text is a world, and we're not interested in context. You know, we deal with this question in terms of poetry. When Auden writes his great poem about the death of Yeats, what is he bringing to it from his life? The new criticism suggests, let's just look at the poem as a world and not worry about context, biography, and so on. Lynn is suggesting that there's another, that's what we've been doing here with the Rashi, so to speak. We've been looking at the texts. But Lynn is suggesting there's another way of understanding text, and that is in the context of their environment. I can't understand the golden calf incident unless I reckon with the struggles among priestly houses when it was written, and see the struggle between an Aaronite priestly house and what scholars call a Mushite priestly house. Moses does a lot of priestly things. It may be that his claim on priestliness and his family was finally pushed aside by the Aaronites, who suppressed obvious claims, statements about the Mosaic priesthood. That would be looking at the context. There's a wonderful book on this by, I mention it all the time, Richard Elliott Friedman, who wrote the Bible. Friedman looks at questions just like this, and in fact, he drills down so far as to be able to name names. Who wrote this book? Who wrote that book? And so on. Turns out Jeremiah has a big hand in writing much of the Bible. Bill?
I think many commentators on the Bible start intrinsically to bring out an explanation. And as I think the person commented, I think time and progress of time makes things intrinsic, where the reader then starts developing something far beyond what the commentator was thinking, and using, shall we say, his language to adapt it to a whole new world of thought.
Yeah, and I think you raise a good point. In principle, is there any limit to intrinsicness? Is there any limit to what something could mean? And the other way of looking at it is, yeah, the limit is right there at the beginning. Look at the thing itself and don't bother me with interpretation, because that's all intrinsic and extrinsic in principle. I mean, it can go both ways. Okay, why don't we then go on to the next thing we want to look at, and that's on page 4. And now we're going to look at this narrative, so-called, of Leviticus 17 and 18, from hate to love. Oh, but first this is what I left out. Back to the text itself. Don't go about tale-bearing against your neighbor. So on page 4, paragraph 2, this is now Maimonides. Who is a talebearer? A gossip. This is about gossip. A gossip is one who carries reports, because the word rochel in Hebrew also means merchant. Don't be like a merchant. Think about a merchant in a way. The merchant moves from society to society without a great deal of fidelity to the well-being of that society, and flits about, maybe that's the wrong verb, between person and person, and here's a lot of stuff, but isn't so worried about the idea of gossip because he's in and out of that community. I mean, the idea of gossip having an analogy to the ways of a merchant are intriguing. Who's a talebearer? One who carries reports and goes about from one person to another and says, so-and-so said this. Such and such a statement have I heard about so-and-so. Even if what he says or repeats may be true. Now, the add-on here is true and positive. Even if what he says about the person is a compliment and true, the talebearer ruins the world. What's wrong with my saying that X is a really wise person, and it turns out that X is a wise person? That comes under the category of gossip here. So let's keep that in mind and go on a little bit. There is still a graver offense that comes with this prohibition, namely the evil tongue. This means talking disparagingly of anyone, even though what one says is true. So now we have two categories. Talk about another person, about that person, what we say is true and positive. That's not stated here in the first one, but I'm contrasting it with what is stated. Example 2 is saying something about another person to a third party. That is true but disparaging. That means the first sentence ought to be true but complimentary. Even the true but complimentary counts as gossip, which is not a good thing. But now we have two ways of two examples, two kinds of ways. But he, I'm at the middle of about the 6th line, who utters a falsehood is called a slanderer. So that's our third category. A person with an evil tongue is one who, sitting in company, says, that person did such a thing. So-and-so's ancestors were so-and-so. By the way, notice, sitting in company. Let's take company here as one person, just as an example of company. So we have a triangle. We have A, B, and C. A talks to B about C. C is not there. And company can mean one or many. The crucial thing here is the structure of this. A says to B something about C, and C is not there. A person with an evil tongue is one who's sitting in company and said, that person did such and such a thing. So-and-so's ancestors, so-and-so. I have heard this about him. And then proceeds to talk scandal. So that one comment may lead on to other comments. That's one problem with it. Of such a person, Scripture says, may the Lord cut off all smooth lips, the tongue that speaketh proud things. Can we talk a little bit about what is wrong with gossip in any of its manifestations? Taking into account this, and then proceeds to talk scandal. I'm going to give you an example from my own life. I have never thought that saying something complimentary about another person to a third party is a problem. I can say about X to Y, you know, X is really a wonderful person. Picks his mother up and takes her shopping and so on and so on. What's wrong with that? Here's what I think is wrong with it, or at least one thing. Bennett, you want to say something about it?
It could be like the, I can't think of the name of the family that was making Oxycontin, and they were giving a lot of money to charity. You would say this is a very wonderful family that gave a lot of money to charity, but they were pushing drugs on the population, so they're not really that wonderful.
Okay. So that you're saying that what's wrong with it is if I say something complimentary about someone or some group who also happens to be engaged of something problematic, in a way, what's the problem with it? I'm only giving one part of the whole. I'm offering too pure an understanding of this. There's more. I want to focus on there is more, which is negative in this example. Okay, Candy?
You put yourself in a position of judgment that's inappropriate.
Why is it inappropriate? It's true, isn't it? This is a wonderful person.
it's not up to me to make a judgment on what another person does.
Okay.
Only myself.
Okay, so you seem to be suggesting that by doing this, I'm arrogating to myself more importance than I should have. I am not so important as to be able to comment about another person.
That's
Okay.
right.
So it has something to do with one's understanding of oneself.
But I don't understand, if you tell that person what you think of him, and it's positive, and it helps him, if that's a good thing or not.
This
Because it
isn't.
seems nice to be able to give people compliments, and they respond very well to it, but you're still putting yourself in that position of judgment, and I don't think that that's a good thing to do.
Okay, so you're introducing another structure. Let me see if I understand you. Let's talk about you and Flo. I'm going to tell Flo about you. A, B, C. And you're not there. That seems to be problematic, and we're trying to figure that out. I think you're saying that there's another kind of structure at work here. I'm talking to Flo, and I'm complimenting her. Why should I not be able to talk about another person, but here, to that person, and not about a third person? And I don't think that's the issue here. As a matter of fact, this notion of rebuke is the underside of that. Talking to the person, him or herself. If Flo has done me wrong, I have a choice. Should I confront Flo and criticize her or not? And the Torah here is saying, yes, I should. I should talk that's directed to the person, him or herself, is not problematic structurally. I mean, I can overdo the criticism. I might get it wrong, but that's permitted, even mandatory. But talking about you to Flo, so as long as it's just A to B, it's a different sort of thing. Whereas what we're talking about is A to B to C. But you're pointing out something interesting, Candy, and that is one's assessment of oneself. Do I have the right to render a judgment about another person? And whether in particular I do or don't, the question is about how I'm seeing myself, for better or for worse, validly or invalidly. And that comes up. What's the
Yeah, but if you're complimenting somebody, there could be a few issues. You can be complimenting Flo on something she has done or said, okay?
I'm saying this to you about Flo,
You're saying it to me about Flo.
and I'm complimenting Flo.
Okay. Depending on the person you're talking to, I could either take that as, wow, he really likes this woman. He really thinks highly of her. I may go and tell somebody else what you said.
Yes.
Which may get turned around and taken in a different way, okay? And if somebody else were in earshot, the whole thing could have been down the drain. I mean,
Okay.
you're really in trouble.
Going out of control.
Yeah.
Yeah. Notice, by the way, this is pointed out here near the end of that first paragraph, and then proceeds to talk scandal. Third-party talk, tends to lead to more third-party talk. I don't know about you. I mean, I've often felt there's something really satisfying about forming an alliance with B. I'm A. With B against C. I've got a friend here. We're a unit here. And part of what makes us feel tight with one another is we've got somebody to talk about. So there's a seductiveness about it, and one kind of talk might lead to another example, and pretty soon it's spread all around. Right. Also, here's what I've noticed about myself, just to be a little confessional. I try not to do it very much, but I see myself doing it. Talking about a person and saying something complimentary, hoping in a way that the person I'm telling it to might have a negative feeling. I have that negative feeling, but I don't want to really admit it. But if I say, well, isn't this person great? So that's another problem with it. It can lead to negative talk. The contagiousness of talk.
But how can you compliment a person on something they're doing really well? I mean, that's what communication is.
Well, but that gets back to, we're looking at a triangle here, and not a binary relationship.
Okay.
This isn't about A and B. I can say to that person anything I want to, as long as I say it to the person about whom I'm talking.
But that person can say something to somebody else, turn it around completely, which will negate what you have said.
I say X to B, I say something to B, and that's complimentary. B can do whatever he or she wants with it. True?
That is correct.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
if B, or A, B,
Yes.
goes to C
Yes.
and turns around what you said,
About B. B turns around what I've said about B. B
Yeah.
turns around something I've said to him.
there could be a negative, it could become negative.
Well, I say something to B. B says what I've said to him to C.
And C interprets differently.
Well, I think B has to make a calculation. Is C the kind of person who might turn it around? So that's a different problem, but at least I've talked to the person, and the person, him or herself, knows what I've said, as opposed to not knowing what I've said, and obviously can do whatever he or she wants. Gary?
I've read this commentary by Maimonides on a number of occasions.
Yes,
before, and
yes.
I always walked away scratching my head, because if you go back to verse 16,
Yes.
it says, "Do not deal basely with your countrymen, do not profit by the blood of
Right.
your fellow, I am the Lord."
Right.
The
That's right.
commentary is really quite abstract compared to what the actual verse says.
Well, you know, what does the footnote say? The meaning of the Hebrew is uncertain.
Yeah.
So this is the translation of it, that this particular set of interpreters, translators, but it's quite clear that our tradition, Rashi being an example, understands it as trafficking in talk. Yeah, I think it's too bad. Do not deal basely with your, because it now eliminates the whole issue of loose talk about a third person.
And my other concern about this discussion is that, quite honestly, I find it impractical. It is what humans do.
Yes.
You know, on a daily basis, whether the intent is positive or negative. This is not a practical interpretation or even a practical way of living.
The talk about gossip.
Yes.
Yeah, so what you're saying is that here's a normative stance, don't do X, but human beings are inveterately inclined to do X, so what's the point of saying don't do it? Is that your point?
It is, and novels have been written literally about these concepts.
Right.
It's just humanity.
So there's a difference here between exploring who we are, and I take it that novels tend to do that, open up the complexities of what it means to be human. But there's also the assumption that human beings can be educated, that the things that we are inclined to do can be tempered in some way or another, through imperatives, through reward and punishment, through an assessment of what it means if you continue to do this. You know, recently I read a book on, it was the name of the book was something, What's Divine About Divine Law? And the author divides the function of law into two categories, there are probably more. One is to put a brake on our impulses, especially the destructive ones. And the other is to educate us, to help transform our behavior. We all believe, don't we, that education is not worthless, that I can be trained. I guess there's a difference in training and education. One is getting me to behave in a certain way, the other may be to kind of transform my impulses, my motivation. So don't you think, on the assumption that gossip is a bad thing, don't you think it's worthwhile for a society to try to tame it and to stop it, especially if it's corrosive?
Yes.
Okay. But I think your point remains that we're probably never going to get rid of it entirely because this is the way we are. Human nature being what it is. You know, I remember this is what Thucydides says in the introduction to the Peloponnesian History of the Peloponnesian Wars. I didn't write, he says, for the applause of the moment, but for something, I can't remember the noun, do you? For all time. I'm not writing for today, I'm writing for all time. On the assumption that this history was not just about those years of that war, but something about human nature, which in some sense is a constant. And this is your point. This is the way we are. But we can be talked out of it to some degree, either with the blandishments of reward or getting the point and working on it. That's why defund the police is a bad idea, isn't it? Let's go on a little bit. So, paragraph 3. The sages say there are 3 offenses for which one is punished in this world and forfeits his position in the world to come. Okay? So what they're driving at here is there are 3 major offenses. And the world to come can be understood in at least 2 ways. One, literally, and it's quite clear the rabbis believe in life after death. Either the ongoing existence of the body, the resurrection of the body, or the immortality of the soul. That's an assumption of Rabbinic Judaism. Or it can be understood metaphorically, I might say. This is a fancy way of saying, and we really mean it, that there's something ultimate at stake here. There are 3 offenses for which one is punished in this world and is getting something fundamentally wrong. There are a lot of offenses for which I am punished. These, there's an additional penalty. You forfeit your place in the world to come. Literally, you don't go there. Figuratively, and this is ultimate. We're not talking about just any old law and its consequences. These are idolatry, incest, or murder. And the rabbis say about the 613 commandments in the Torah, you know, that's the number they have, that 610 of them can be suspended in certain circumstances. But there are 3, idolatry, adultery, and murder, for which they cannot be suspended, even at the cost of my life. In other words, if my life is in danger, I can suspend all 610 of the 613, because life is more important than 610 of the commandments. But life is not the ultimate concern. There are 3 commandments which makes life less important than being faithful to those commandments. It makes room for martyrdom. That is a point at which your life is not your ultimate concern. If life is our ultimate concern, period, then martyrdom is always wrong. But traditions, especially traditions which have God in the picture, think that martyrdom under certain circumstances is valid. So these are I might call them the big three. If you're forced to commit idolatry or adultery on penalty of death, you are to die rather than commit this sin. Now, it's made more complex in terms of the times, the context, the occasion, and so on. But that's what's at stake here. So, why is Maimonides introducing ultimate concern? The stakes are very high here in this discussion about gossip. This is the context in which ultimacy is brought up. Let's start again. There are 3 offenses for which one is punished in this world and forfeits his portion in the world to come: idolatry, incest, and murder. If you commit incest, you're punished here and you lose your place in the world to come. But the evil tongue is equal to all 3 put together. How am I to assess the problem with gossip? Here's how I'll do it. I'll make it more important than the 3 most important commandments, the violation of which I punished here and I lose my place in the world to come. Now gossip becomes the worst crime of all. And the question is, how are we to understand this? See how interesting this is? Maimonides is going for broke here in the name of the tradition. This is the Mission of Torah, which is a summary, a distillation of Jewish law for the last 2,500 years before him. Okay, that should be the end of the sentence, the paragraph, shouldn't it? I mean, how much more do you need to say? Gossip is the ultimate sin. Why go on? And yet Maimonides goes on. The sages further said, to indulge in evil speech is like a denial of the fundamental principle of religion. As it is said, now here comes a quote, which is meant to illustrate the fundamental principle of religion. And let's see if we get what that principle is. As it is said, who said, no, that's not a question. Who said, our tongue will we make mighty, our lips are with us, who is Lord over us? What principle is that quote from Psalm 12 an illustration? Any guesses about it?
First of all, that's not exactly what Psalm 12 says.
Oh, is that true? Very good. I never went back to it. Okay. Psalm 12. Good. I mean, partly good.
Verse 5, right?
12:5.
It really refers, it says, for you are Psalm 12.
Yeah.
Psalm here.
5. They say, by our tongues we shall prevail, with lips such as ours, who can be our master?
All right. I still don't see what principle it represents.
Okay, well, what principle do you think? Here's the principle. I'll tell you what I think. The principle is idolatry. And who's the idolater here, And what is the idolater idolizing? The idolater is the person. And what's the person fetishizing, making into an idol? Himself. Who said our tongue we will make mighty? Our lips are with us. I don't know what that contributes. Who is Lord over us? The answer to that question by the questioner is no one. This is Candy's point earlier, that gossip arrogates to me more importance than I have. Who is the gossip to create so much mischief that it can unravel society? I talk about flow to Jackie. Jackie talks to Candy. Candy talks to Bennett, to Jeff. Pretty soon, in this kind of exaggeration of what happens, but we know what happens. Talk gets around. And if I find out that my friend is talking about me to somebody else, I'm questioning the friendship a little bit, aren't I? This unravels a friendship. The person who thinks so much of him or herself that is willing to talk, to engage in gossip. Isn't X a wonderful person? How innocent a statement could that be? What's the problem with that? That is a problem.
Maybe they are, maybe.
Yeah, Lynn?
What I was thinking from the get-go was that maybe all of this means you can discuss with others conceptual things, but you should not talk about someone else except to that person that you want to compliment or comment to. But there shouldn't, if you want to say that person is nice, you should say it to the person. And saying it to somebody else, like you said, can lead off to, well, I don't think this, or, gee, he didn't say that about me.
Yeah.
He does not care or think about me as highly. And, you know, the old saying, you're entitled to your own opinion.
Yes, sure.
Are, but opinion maybe not of a person. You know, you shouldn't talk about a person, good or bad. You should tell that person himself, or that person should be there in that company.
And when I
think
talk,
you're very nice, you know, and say to the person, even though other people might be there, you should direct it to the person.
as a matter of fact, the text that we're going to look at says that I can even criticize, I can rebuke the other person. I mean, I can say anything to the other person, though, as we'll see, there's a way of saying things even to another person. There's an ethics of how to, there's an ethics of the talk which is normatively good. Let's go on a little bit. See where we are here? That gossip has now become the summum bonum, the summum malum, the worst thing you can do. And let's go on and see how this finishes up. The sages also said, the evil tongue slays 3 persons. The utterer of the evil, that's A. The listener, that's B. And the one spoken about, that's C. Slays 3 persons. 3 persons are victims of gossip. A and B and C. And the listener, B, will be punished worse than the speaker. I talked to Flo about Candy. Flo is the most culpable of all. Why?
But what if I said back to you, I've only had positive experiences with Candy. I don't want to hear anything negative.
there's a difference between I only have positive experiences and I don't want to hear it. That's why B is culpable, because B allows it to flourish. Because you're the one who is passing something on. You're allowing me. You're allowing gossip to flourish. I had lunch with a rabbi who's no longer here in the community. I mean, I've often asked myself, if we didn't talk about other people, how much talk is there left for us? I mean, that's what we do. That's Gary's point about human nature. And, you know, it seems innocent, and we don't mean any harm by it. But I think it's my mind is exploring it. And I started talking about to this rabbi, somebody else, and he said to me, I don't want to hear this. I was shocked, because I think he was rebuking me for even talking about it. And by the way, this happened maybe 20 years ago. I still remember the moment. It was a moment at which I was, the wrongfulness of what I was doing was pointed out. I meant it innocently. But innocent talk is corrosive. Yeah.
Was that true all the way through the discussion, or just with that one particular subject that you were bringing up?
What do you mean, subject?
Well, you brought up something he said, don't do that. Previous to that, had you been speaking generally about other people as well, having a discussion? Or did he stop you altogether?
He stopped me altogether. Even the talk, because one of the categories here is talk about a third person that is positive, complimentary, and true. Can't even do that. We can't talk about other people according to this. It's a very high standard. I've often asked myself, what percentage of the conversations that I have in a day are in some way or another about another person? What's the problem with gossip? Jeff?
A problem, when I read the fundamental principle of religion in Judaism is that we're responsible for our own actions.
Yes.
I think the problem with gossip is you're creating a judgment about a person not based on your own experience of that person, but based on what Roger has told me about it, for good or bad. Now, it's difficult because we have our reputation, and our reputation is based on what Bill says to Roger, among other things. But I think a fundamental principle is don't talk about C for good or ill. I guess there are two reasons. One is if you talk good, speak well about someone, you're inclined to speak not so well about someone else. I mean, the evil inclination, I think it's also what Gary said. It's almost inevitable. If you take it upon yourself to say, Jeff was great last night, you may say to someone else, God, he was terrible.
Yeah. So once the spigot is open, no matter how benignly, it's likely to fester, to continue.
And to create a judgment about someone not based on his or your own interaction with him.
Are you saying that if I say something about Candy to Flo, that Flo is likely to give too much weight to that, and that will alter her view of Candy? Is that what you're saying?
Based on what you say.
Based on what I say.
Based on her own interaction with Flo.
Let's suppose you like
Flo's
me.
own actions.
Let's suppose you like me or respect me, and I say something about Candy. You may feel, here's a guy I like. Maybe that's not my experience of Candy, but maybe, wait a minute, let me rethink Candy here. So that, and what's the result of this? Isn't it the corrosion of the social order? Doesn't society in a way depend upon the non-proliferation of talk about third parties, because we become, it distorts Flo's view of Candy. Flo's worried that if I'm talking about Candy to her, maybe I'm talking about her to somebody else. And now she's suspicious of me. She's more suspicious of Candy. And one thing can lead to another. I mean, I think Maimonides is making the claim that the well-being of the community depends upon no gossip.
Roger, can I follow up on my
Of course.
point? I'm sorry to do this.
Of course, no.
I think it affects the relationship between the speaker and the listener for this reason. If I'm worried that you're going to gossip about me to someone else, it's inevitably going to affect what I say to you and how I'm going to act with you. And when you talk about the social fabric, even if the two of us are having lunch and talking, I may not say what I really think because what I really want to do is impress you.
Yeah.
And I think that does affect the social fabric. We're
That-
less honest with each other.
That's a good point. So even the binary relationship itself can be skewed by this kind of thing. So relationships become imperiled, not only through the listener and the speaker, but with the implications. There's a kind of ripple. There, you drop a pebble in the water and there are these ripple effects. It ripples. One little pebble, one little circle becomes a variety of concentric circles until the whole pond is affected by one little pebble in the water, if you get my analogy. Candy?
Don't you have to make an exception here for personal versus public
Yeah.
consumption?
Like what?
Like, where do you put the media, the public media in all of this? And for instance, two candidates running for office, and the newspaper comes out in favor of one of them, or an editor, or a letter to the,
It's not bad.
It's an interesting
a
point.
personal letter to the newspaper in favor of a person, talking about that person, and trying to change a whole community's mind about the goodness or the evilness of a person. So I think you have to make an exception between public comments and personal
Yeah.
comments.
Well, so I think you're raising the interesting question of what are the other forces in a society that can have a corrosive impact on the well-being of that society. And one of them is the media.
Education is also the same thing.
You know,
This whole brouhaha about book burning. Some people think it's their job to educate the world to the negativity of some books.
so here's an
Isn't
analogy.
it just gossip?
Well, is it gossip? That's the question. I mean, it's certainly problematic. It can be problematic. Is it gossip? Here's an analogy that just occurred to me. You won't be surprised that it's a baseball analogy. So, what things contribute to a certain team's winning a ball game? One of them is if the second baseman knows how to turn the double play. And if you've got a second baseman, the ball's hit to the man on first, the ball's hit to the shortstop, second baseman covers second, tags the base, and then has to turn and throw it to first to get the batter. And if the second baseman can't turn the double play, this is a problem for the team. What else? That the third baseman needs to be able to field the bunt. If there's a bunt, just a little this, the third baseman needs to run in, pick the ball up with one hand, and throw to first in time. That's a tough thing to do as turning the double play. Let's focus on the second baseman for a minute. What does the second baseman need to do and not do? What kind of talk is good and what kind of talk isn't? And we analyze what being a bad second baseman is. And yes, we're focusing on that. And yes, a second baseman who can't turn the double play is a problem for the team. society. That's the analogy here. Then you come along and you say, but what about the third? You've been focusing on the second baseman. What about the third baseman? The media. To which my response is, here's the point of the analogy. Yes, there are a variety of ways that imperil the team's chances. But let's focus on the second baseman for a while. That's what we're doing this morning. We're focusing on gossip between and among people, recognizing, as you're pointing out, that there are a lot of other forces that imperil the social good. And that's true. But what's the difference between gossip and the media? Gossip is something that I can do if I go to Eat at Joe's and sit at the stool at the counter. I can do this. I got two people here that I can start talking about somebody. In other words, gossip is something that can happen 1,000,000 times a day, and therefore is a big problem. It's true the media is a problem. It's a different kind of problem. Wouldn't you say it's a different kind of problem with potentially the same effects? I mean, there is free speech, freedom of the press. We count on the press to be ethical about it. They're also in the business of making money. Why do the owners in this current baseball dispute, want to add 4 teams to the playoffs? They want to go from 10 to 14. What's the reason for that? Money. That's when people watch baseball. That's when advertisers pay money for advertisement. The press also is in the business. I mean, it's much more I'm not in the business of making money when I talk to Flo about candy. It's more ubiquitous. It's more common. It's less complex in a way. I don't know. But you're right. You're right. Maybe we'll find a Maimonides that talks about newspapers. which were, I mean, newspapers in that day were written on stone slabs.
Yeah, but there's always some guy standing on a soapbox.
Oh, for sure.
And that's the key.
And talking about the other candidate. Yeah. No, it's a problem. That's why a lot of great people never run for office, because it's gotten out of hand. You make your family vulnerable to months of talk. Gary?
Can we go back to that paragraph 3 here? To indulge in evil speeches like denial of fundamental principles of religion. Also, the statement that the 3 of them together, but the evil tongue is equal to all 3 put together. Isn't that a qualitative statement?
Yes. Don't you think?
It is. And is that something that we can all agree on?
Well, that's a good point. In other words, you're asking whether or not the opinion of the author that this is the worst possible. Let's line up all the sins. Bottom to top. The higher we go, the worse the sin. At the very top is gossip. Who agrees that all things considered, gossip is the worst sin of all? Who agrees with that? Nobody. I'm close to agreeing. I mean, murder sounds like worse. Certainly worse for the individual, but it's not necessarily worse for society. Gossip kills a society. A gun kills one person. I'm making this up. I'm sorry?
Multiply that. A gun, one gun, yes, one person, or possibly one gun, many persons.
Yeah.
Depending upon who's handling the gun.
So I could say that killing somebody is one act, and gossip spreads to be many acts, to which you're responding, but a gun can also be a multiplier.
I think we're seeing that right now with the spree of crime.
Right. Let me go back to something you've said. It's possible, in theory, to limit guns. You could toughen the law, the investigation laws, the registration laws. You make a punishment. You can find a way, if there's a will And if the NRA wasn't so powerful, could you ever do the same thing with gossip? Your answer, I think, is no. Using guns is not a part of function of human nature. Gossip is. That, in a way, makes it worse.
But is gossip equal to those three? I mean, you have A, B, C. Do they all equal D?
Yeah. So
Or
it's
A, B, and C
possible.
Less than D.
I'm sorry?
Is A, B, and C less than D?
Less than D, who's going to be killed by a gun.
No. Gossip. D is gossip. A.
Oh, I see. D is
D
gossip.
is incest.
Is A, B, and C, are they together, those three sins, less than D? Yeah.
Haven't we gotten off the beaten track?
Yes.
No,
Maybe.
I know we have, but I was talking about from the very beginning.
Yes.
When you were talking to so-and-so about somebody else. you
Yes.
said, this person is very nice. This is not what that's about. This is about the evil things that can happen from words that aren't a compliment to somebody.
I think that my mind,
If you read this, it's a lot of the evil stuff, which is gossip, and I don't know what the dictionary says gossip is, but I don't think gossip is telling one person that another person is a very nice person.
you know,
And also, if we don't do that, we lose the intimacy of human beings. So I think gossip, we should really talk about again what gossip really is. And I
Yeah,
think
well,
that's what you said.
it's an interesting point. I think Maimonides, were he here, so now I'm a spokesman,
You are
would
he.
say, no, what I've written is right. Any third-party talk is bad, even the complimentary stuff, because it can lead to other things, suspiciousness, the erosion of friendships, the erosion of the social glue. Even if I say to you, Gary is let's suppose you're a friend of Gary.
Yeah.
But, okay, but.
We live 2 doors away.
Okay, very good. But there are some things about Gary that worry you, that bother you. Even our best friends. Am I the only guy who feels, even about his best friends, that I have everything is totally wonderful? We're all human beings, and we assess people all the time in terms of, gosh, the preponderance of who this person is wonderful. I love this person. I just wish that this person wouldn't. This person eats with his mouth open. This is a wonderful person. I mean, I feel like David and Jonathan. I feel like, who are the great friendships in history? Abelard and Eloise. You know, Abelard, what do you think of Eloise? God, she is an astonishingly wonderful person. That's it?
Keep right.
Well, look, if you're really asking me about Eloise, who I think is spectacular, she eats with her mouth open. And I say to, who's a contemporary of Abelard and Eloise? I don't know, Saint Benedict. I say to Saint Benedict, you know, Eloise eats with her mouth open. I mean, so we're likely to open, this is my point. We're likely to open up that talk about the negative aspects of the people we love. If somebody says to me, let's suppose I'm St. Benedict, and Abelard says to me, Eloise eats with her mouth open. Am I worried about Eloise a little bit? I mean, even positive talk, if it's a saint I'm talking about, maybe I can say to somebody else, this is a wonderful person. But don't you think human nature enters in here? And even if I say positive things, it may open up some rawnesses and so on. And at least Maimonides, I think, is pretty clear.
That's gossip.
It's got, the principle is not, don't say anything bad about somebody to somebody else. Don't say anything about somebody else to somebody else. Let's have a little experiment here. Let's all of us go through our week. And I will not, all I'll do is say, did you guys do it? Not anything about what you come up with. Let's just watch ourselves and see whether or not we engage in any of this. And whether it's very hard not to. And is it corrosive? Maybe the corrosiveness is overstated. Jackie?
Yes, somebody asked, what is gossip?
Uh-huh.
Casual or unconstrained conversation or reports about other people, typically involving details that are not confirmed as being true.
Oh.
That's the answer from Google.
Yeah, but who's... yeah.
It's got to be true.
It's not
Maimonides, Google. Yeah, the dictionary is worthless.
I know. But somebody asked me.
But very good, yeah. Okay, I think we'll stop. Next week we'll continue with these sheets. I thought to myself this morning, but this isn't enough for a whole session. Shabbat shalom. Yeah.
Even if we don't speak it, are we polluting ourselves?
I heard that.
Well, I suppose one could say that, but at least by thinking it, I'm not, because I think,
Get out of the world.
I'm sorry?
I would not be able to get out of the world.
Because I think finally what is